Okay.
Yes, you can start. Yeah.
So, good evening, everyone. On behalf of Students Federation of India, I would like to invite all of you to today's lecture. So, I'm Aisha Abdul Qadir, and I was the General Secretary of the Students Union. And so, we started off with this lecture series yesterday, largely covering the topics of labor crisis and racism. And the topic for today's lecture is the Empire Strikes Back: Race and Rebellion in America. So, the topic of discussion gains its relevance, especially in the context of the brutal police encounter of George Floyd and the resultant ongoing protests against violence and systematic racism towards Black people. So, our speaker for the day is Dr. Ashok Kumar, who is a lecturer in political economy at Birkbeck University of London. He is also the editorial board member of Historical Materialism Journal, and recently he published his book, Monopsony Capitalism: Power and Production in the Twilight of the Sweatshop Age. So we have structured the lecture for today in a manner where Dr. Ashok will speak first, and following which we'll take the questions and have a short discussion. Over to you, Dr. Ashok.
Thank you, Aisha, for that introduction. And thanks to comrades Dipshita and Omkar for inviting me to speak, specifically on the question of rebellion in the US. But I'm going to use that as a kind of foil to discuss race and capitalism more generally, the role that race plays, specifically in the US, and then a little bit about my book, which isn't actually about that, but is actually about labor, but obviously they're all bound together. And so I was asked just before we started to talk a little bit about my time as a student activist. So I don't want to be, I'm not being self-indulgent here, just in terms of, because obviously as a student association, that's SFI is. And so whether it could be helpful, I was co-president of my union in Wisconsin and Madison, and as well as the co-president, this is a while ago, of the London School of Economics Students Union, separated by about 7 years each. But what I found was that that the most effective way that we were mobilizing people was around kind of a singular, well, there was like kind of maybe you could say 3 parts to what was the vision around how we organized. It was, firstly, we saw our role, especially in places like London School of Economics. The way I saw my role was, it's very rare that the left actually takes control of the union. So Andre Gors has this idea of reformist reforms and non-reformist reforms. And reformist reforms are just sort of things that you work on, and they happen one day and then they might not be relevant the next day. So a minimum wage increase might be an example of reformist reform. They're helpful, but they're not transformative. A non-reformist reform is a way in which you can introduce a reform that fundamentally alters the social and power relations of a union, of a state, of a government, of whatever. He's talking about government. So when we came in, we attempted to get rid of the trustee board, which we thought was outside influence. We tried to democratize it, so we get rid of the student union council and make it based on mass meetings. So these kinds of reforms I thought was kind of central to try to introduce those reformist reforms that would live past when we are president or vice president or whatever it is. The second element is to run campaigns that are linked to national organization. Of course, SFI already does that, but the most effective way we thought, well, the way I thought about it and the people I was campaigning with was to attack the management of the university, attack it meaning campaign against them individually. Often this is very effective. And at LSE and Wisconsin, both of the directors stepped down at the end of our campaigns and then also capitulated to lots of our demands. Because these are individuals with their own kinds of, rent-seeking and fame-seeking ambitions. So it's a very effective way to do a campaign. And the last thing is basically to look at campaigns and strategy around campaigns that radicalize and politicize the most students. Universities everywhere, especially humanities and social sciences, are attacked by the right for a set of reasons. They see it as a red base and they see it as an ideological battle, and it is. And so I guess that's my more general thoughts on this. I hope that's okay. But yeah, obviously, feel free to ask any questions about that, even though that's not really what the talk is about today. I'm happy to field them. So about the talk, obviously this is about what had happened to George Floyd a bit more than a week ago in Minneapolis, and he was choked to death by one officer while three officers were looking on. But I think we need to go back a little bit. And so I chose the title, The Empire Strikes Back, because, well, it's a Star Wars reference, and it's a text from Paul Gilroy, who writes about race, but specifically in England, but around the world. It's a Star Wars reference because it's episode 5 of Star Wars, and it's called The Empire Strikes Back. And basically the story is that, in episode 4, the Rebel Alliance, so the rebels, had destroyed this kind of moon-sized Imperial spacecraft controlled by the Imperial power, and which was capable of destroying entire planets, the way that America is capable of destroying countries, and has. And it's called the Death Star. And the rebels destroy this. And so in episode 5, the Imperial powers respond and attempt to sort of smoke out the rebel forces. And I think that the stage that we're in right now is basically the Empire striking back. Then you get to episode 6, which is the redemption story where the Return of the Jedi gets, and so maybe that'll happen, but we don't know. Anyways, the structure of today, of the talk will be, I'll start with race and capitalism, the relationship between them, then specifically the relationship between race in America as it relates to the subjectivity of indigenous people versus slaves, the kind of emergence of the prison and the police, specifically in America, but also more generally under capitalism. The role of the ghetto, this is very specific to the US, and the labor market, or what we would think of as a labor fix for capitalism. And then the 2014 riots in Ferguson that happened under Obama, and then what's kind of happening now. But obviously it's very live what's happening now. It's fast moving. So any kind of analysis will probably, by the end of the talk, will have changed anyways, because everything's fast moving. Okay. So to begin, I was going to say a little vignette based on Zizek, Slavoj Zizek. Many of you know the Slovenian Marxist, Hegelian. I mean, I'm not a huge fan, but this is a funny little vignette that he says, where he says, he's channeling Jacques Lacan, the French psychoanalyst, that he says that basically he gives this story that he says, not story, but vignette or allegory. He says, it's Sunday, and you have this kind of good old-fashioned totalitarian father, what he calls the modern father. And he says, son, I want you to go see your grandmother. It's Sunday, it's time to go see your grandmother. And the son says, I don't want to go see my grandmother. And he says, if you don't see your grandmother, I'm going to beat you. So there's a clear antagonism between the son and the father. The son goes, but he goes begrudgingly, and that antagonism is a conscious antagonism, right? Think of the state when you think of this. Then he says there's this so-called postmodern father. Postmodern father is this tolerant father, right? Think Obama. And so the father says, it's Sunday. I'd like to see, you should go see your grandmother. You know how much your grandmother loves you. But nonetheless, you should only visit her if you really want to. So the son goes. Not only does he feel like he's chosen to go, he believes he likes it, right? So this is this sort of insidious nature of the postmodern father versus the modern father. With the moderately oppressive father, it kind of gives you a space to resist. And so this is what I would keep in mind when I'm talking about the changing evolution, development of American civic life, democracy, capitalism, and the kind of juxtaposition between Obama and Trump. Anyways, so there's a kind of variety of ways that people have analyzed race, of course, like anything. But what we can all kind of agree on is that race, different ideologies can agree on, is that race is socially contingent, it's spatially contingent, it's socially constructed. It's not a real thing, right? Its effects are real, of course, but it's not real. Like, it's not biologically real, of course. I'm going to be taking specifically a Marxist perspective because I'm a Marxist, but also it's the correct position. That racism and capitalism are inextricably linked. They're bound together. That capitalism depends on racism for the purposes of profit. And that simply, it sort of helps in the most blunt way, that it helps to divide the working class. But there's obviously more complexity to that. And I'll be going through that. The ideas of race obviously early ideas around race predetermining the pre modes of production. So capitalism used racism to justify sort of plunder and colonialism and slavery, but also used racism to divide and rule the sort of once slaves and peasants when they become wage laborers, right? The accusation that liberals often make, and I'm sure that the experience of in India is not different because it's the experience of Marxists everywhere, that liberals will make is that Marxists diminish the centrality of race. It isn't the case. It's that we want to highlight and understand why race happens so that we can dismantle it. And so the ideas of race are also bound up with the structural power of workers. So I go into this at quite length, not specifically around the race issue, but around the structural power of workers in my book, and Aisha mentioned it earlier, Monopsony Capitalism. But that under capitalism, there are primarily two. There are others, but there's primarily two elements to structural power. That's the power that's imposed on workers. It's that you are in where you're positioned. So let's say you're a worker at a dock. You're working at a port. You have much more bargaining power just based on where you're positioned, not necessarily on skill, than if you are a worker who's cleaning a house. One has a lot of structural power. The other one has less structural power based on position. The second element is based on the labor market. So if you have, under capitalism, you can't have full employment. Many of you know this. You couldn't have, because you couldn't make, the capitalists couldn't make adequate surpluses if you had full employment. That means like there's 10 jobs and there's 10 workers to do it and no surplus labor. That means that capitalism simply couldn't exist under those conditions. So under kind of primitive accumulation, when capitalism is emerging and peasants are kind of being pushed off the land and becoming workers, they had to dispossess a greater number, a greater number, in order to have that reserve army of the unemployed or reserve army of labor who you could then use against existing workers. So the bigger the reserve army, the greater the pressure you can put on workers, the capitalists can. I mean, like last time I was in Bangalore, that's where my family's from. And obviously my family is very petty bourgeois. So anyways, I was talking to my various petty bourgeois family members, and their constant complaint was, it's hard to get good help these days. And I'm like, it's not that it's just hard to get good help. It's that you're not paying them enough because you want to pay them the same thing they were paid 20 years ago. And now there's fewer people willing to do that work for the amount. Why is that? Because of the falling reserve army of labor. It's not that you have less necessarily workers. You have less workers in relation to the number of jobs that are available and the amount of jobs people are willing to do for that amount. And so you might have also a burgeoning middle class, and that's eating up more of that sort of reserve army. So again, like if you have one employer and two employees, then you have much higher bargaining power for workers than if you have 50. Very simple. So in order for capitalism, and specifically in America, you needed this reserve army as a kind of valve to put pressure on specifically white workers. And so it wasn't always material. Like it wasn't always the case that you had this reserve army. And we'll get to this when I'm talking about the ghetto, which is really important when you're thinking about riots. It's not just material. Turn of the century scholar by the name of W.E.B. Du Bois, people may have heard of him, calls that it's also immaterial, that you have a kind of psychological wage of whiteness, that you have both the privileges of material wealth, or not wealth, but greater relative wealth, but then also you have, it's also a state of being. You have, there's a psychological wage that you get from being superior to another person. And so race is important in capitalism everywhere, but it's central to the development of capitalism in America. The ideas around race didn't really exist prior to the late 1600s when enslaved Black people were brought to America in chains. And it's, you think about the system of slavery. Prior to slavery, you had indentured servitude, where people were being, of course, they were exploited, but they were, the landed classes in the U.S. at the time, what is America now, or back then at least, was saw that you could give a little plot of some of the worst land you had to a small section of people, so the whites, in order to enforce enslavement of these newly enslaved people that were being brought to America. And then you go to basically the Civil War, and you have a system in which poor whites are fighting and dying in the mud for a system that dispossesses them from work. They're basically fighting and dying for the system that is actually exploiting them as well. And here ideology is quite central. So specifically about the relationship of race in the US, it's important to have a materialist analysis. You do have a lot of people who talk about race as this thing that exists outside of capitalism. And this is not to try and think about capitalism as, if capitalism ends, will racism exist, blah, 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 blah. That I'm not some kind of soothsayer. I can't look into the future. But what we know is that what exists as the racialized subjectivity, how people are racialized now, we can find a direct trace of that. And so we need to sort of ask ourselves, how are races constructed, under what circumstances, and in whose interests, right? So one of the best texts on this, if people are interested, is by Patrick Wolf. It's very hot here. Patrick Wolf, called Traces of History. And so Patrick Wolf is an Australian scholar, and he begins by talking about the relationship between Black Aboriginal people, who are indeed Black, and Black Americans. Now, if you have a very reductionist idea or culturalist idea, you might think that Black people everywhere are treated badly for the same set of reasons. Not true. It's not that you have this universal hierarchy that exists everywhere at all the same time. And that's actually politically dubious. This is what, fascists and eugenicists believe. We don't believe that. We believe that it's socially and spatially and temporally, historically contingent. It depends on the material conditions, right? So Wolf draws on two distinctions, land and labor. Okay, so you got to follow me here a little bit. But slavery meant that Black Americans were primarily colonized for their labor rather than their land, right? Whereas indigenous Australians, like indigenous people everywhere, including the Americas, were dispossessed for their land, primarily their land. Also a little bit of their labor, but primarily their land. So one is seen as we need to dispossess this group for their land. The other one is that we need to control this group for their labor. So these basic historical differences live in the sort of settler popular culture now, right? Where sort of representations of Black Australians and indigenous Americans resemble each other. They're very similar, right? While, in contrast to this, it's like sharp contrast, Black Americans, their representation is very different. So these racialized differences are, you can draw on them fundamentally, historically, and it's only in their uses by the dominant class, the land and labor. So indigenous people were targeted for extermination. So in the American context, over 100 million were exterminated, literally murdered by the settler population, or the extermination through assimilation, so mixing blood. So they would mix. It was very important for the settler population to mix blood with the indigenous population, or to kidnap their children, which you saw in the Americas and in Australia. And so there was there's a high motivation to integrate, because then you can dispossess them from their land, because it's a form of cultural extermination. While Black Americans were systematically isolated and segregated, so they're excluded, they do this one drop rule. If you have one drop of Black blood in you, you're Black. This segregation, rather than assimilation, is crucial if your relationship to capital, firstly through the feudal system, but then the slave system, and then now capital, if your relationship to capital is as labor. So you have this segregated group rather than an assimilated group. If your relationship to capital is as land, you become assimilated, because then you can take what's theirs in the form of dispossessing them for their land. It's not that complicated. It's possible I'm using complex terms, but it's not complicated at all. I don't even know if I am. So one example of this is, it wasn't until the late 1960s that, up until the late 1960s, it was illegal for white people in America, in a lot of states, to marry Black people, because the idea that you would have these mixing, fundamentally the motivation draws from its trace from history as an enslaved population for the purposes of labor. Okay, now that's a kind of basic outline of of race and its relationship to the dominant classes, but also specifically to the US. The role of the police and prisons under capitalism, and specifically American capitalism, is that I'll give you some statistics on, and this was related to the segregated role of position of Black people in America, and the relationship with prisons. These are some contemporary prison populations. So since 1989, Black Americans make up a majority of people who are put in American prisons, a majority, whereas year on year, whereas Black people make up only 13% of the American population. Today, over 75% of the prison population is Black or Latino, even though they make up less than 30% of the population. The American prison population is 2.2 million and is much higher than anywhere else in the world or in modern history, higher than the height of Stalin's gulags, higher than the highest point of the South African anti-apartheid struggle. It's by far the highest in modern history. And any given day in America, 1 in 3 Black Americans in their 20s find themselves in prison, probation, or parole. So some iteration of the prison industry. This is particularly high in sort of formerly industrialized cities in the North. The police exist primarily as a system to regulate and even produce inequality. They exist to defend property relations, suppress labor unrest or social movements, and tightly manage the laboring lives of poor people and non-white people. The police as a system really emerge in moments of crisis when informal arrangements no longer suffice. This isn't really my opinion. This is borne out in the empirical evidence, right? We know this to be almost certainly true. Not just almost, it's certainly true. So a really brilliant text on this is a text called In the End of Policing by Alex Vital. And Vital argues that the earliest policing in the 18th century had its origins tied to 3 factors: the control of slaves, the control of colonial subjects, and the control of the emergent industrial working class. Against the evidence, again, this evidence is clear. The system of social order is about preservation of inequality and the accumulation of capital. This means that controlling slave revolts, general strikes, and yes, crime and rioting in the streets. This is time and time again, you see this. And I think that's something you should keep in mind when we think about what's happening in America right now. So where I am right now, I'm in London, the London Metropolitan Police, where there's massive protests here around right now, but there was a riot in 2011 that was the largest since the 12th century around a Black man who was killed in London. So the London Metropolitan Police, who are the oldest police force, continue to be an extremely brutal force that manages race relations, and manages capital as a consequence. But it's nothing like that of the U.S. because, it's not nothing like the U.S., but it's because most of them don't carry guns. If they did, it would be just as bad as the U.S., I'm convinced. Anyways, it was originally created in 1929 by a man named Robert Peel. That's why, I don't know if you've heard this term, bobbies on the beat. That's etymology. That comes from Robert Peel. Robert is called Bob as well in this country, in English. Prior to the creation of the Met Police, London had a kind of informal watch. Like in India, I often see, like in bourgeois areas, you have people paid for private watches. And then, you had either that or you had kind of these kind of excessively violent militias who existed exclusively to protect the private property rights of the bourgeoisie, the emergent bourgeoisie or the landed classes. Robert Peel had developed his ideas on policing from his time managing the British colonial occupation in Ireland, where he saw new forms of social control in order to ensure the continued domination in the face of growing insurrections, political uprisings, and riots. The repression by the state, so first, by the militias and the military that were created by the colonial administration, antagonized these rebellious actors, right? So think about the postmodern father and the modern father. So if you have a militia that's trying to suppress these political insurrections, actually the effect can be that it antagonizes it. And it created martyrs, and it bolstered the resistance. So Peel was forced to develop a kind of lower cost and more legitimate form of policing, and it was called the Peace Preservation Force, right? And so he was testing that out in occupied, colonized Ireland. So the emergence of police in England grew directly out of the Peterloo massacre of 1819. So the movement that led to that demonstration and the massacre grew out of kind of widespread poverty and displacement because of industrialization. You had widespread displacement of peasants, primitive accumulation. Marx obviously describes this at length. And so movements sprung up everywhere in England. And at a rally in Manchester, a cavalry charge by the military ends up killing a dozen protesters. So the bourgeoisie felt that what they needed was both a force to maintain control, but also to produce new economic order for industrial capitalism. The result was the London Metropolitan Police. The London model, as it was called, was then imported to Boston in 1938, and then spread throughout cities across the sort of newly industrializing cities of the North, which had seen kind of huge fluxes of immigrants, and so what it did was create a system of even greater economic unevenness, and then a sense of kind of social chaos, particularly for the landed classes, the property classes. The Boston police force was created explicitly to manage riots and widespread social disorder associated with the working class. Specifically, when they were created in 1939, was a response to the Broad Street riots of 1937, where a mob of 15,000 white Protestant probably, attacked Irish immigrants because they felt that this increased reserve army that was, of migrants was bringing down wages and hurting their jobs. Again and again, the creation of the police was tied to the steady management and maintenance of capitalism. New York City's formation of their formal force in 1944, which was actually much stronger and much more robust than any other police force in the country, was a direct result of the explosion of immigrants and the eruption of riots, racial strife, labor unrest. Specifically, they were responding to the black and white dock workers who went on strike and did massive sabotage and destruction in 1802, 1825, 1828, and then subsequent rioting throughout the decade that ultimately led to the formation. To go back to slavery, so slavery was another major force that shaped early US policing. Well before the London Metropolitan Police was formed, southern cities like New Orleans, Savannah, Charleston, had paid these kind of full-time police forces who would wear uniforms and listen to, were held mildly accountable to local officials. They were developed directly as basically slave patrols. And they were there to prevent slave rebellions and revolts. And these patrols were actually given power to go onto private property and ensure that slaves weren't carrying weapons. They didn't have to forewarn the property owner or the slave master in that case, that they weren't conducting meetings and they weren't learning to read and write, because these were all seen as acts of rebellion. Crucially, these patrols prevented slaves from escaping to the north. So the north, lots of slaves would escape from the south to what was, the line of demarcation in the north, not demarcation, the antebellum north, or the antebellum south to free north. But lots of slaves would also free themselves to Canada because they didn't even trust and this we're talking about Harriet Tubman specifically. So they would patrol rural roads. Once slavery is abolished in 1865, following the Civil War. So this is the war I was telling you, the Civil War is where you have poor whites fighting and dying in the mud for a system that keeps them from having employment. That's how serious the ideology was, or the psychological wage of whiteness. So this slave patrol system is abolished, obviously, alongside the official abolishment of slavery. So now you have these small towns developing kind of professional organizations to deal with this newly freed slaves. So the primary purpose of the police was not so much to prevent rebellion now, because there's no slaves, but in order to discipline these former slaves into a new economic and political order. A new set of laws were introduced in order to force Black people to accept employment primarily into the new system. And, so local police enforced poll taxes, segregation, and other methods to suppress the political agency and upward mobility and self-determination of Black people. These laws were called Jim Crow laws, just for reference. So a crucial text when you think about this is a book and also an essay by Louis Wacquant, that's Wacquant, in which he draws a link between the ghetto, the prison, and the labor market. So Louis Kant sort of maps the history from the end of slavery to the present, and he describes how the urban ghetto operated as prisons themselves. So as a way to keep a kind of black reserve army of labor. So when I say reserve army of labor, I mean the reserve army of unemployed people. So you keep this reserve army of labor in a subordinate and confined position, physically, socially, symbolically, in every single way. So this 20th century history sees working aged black men basically shuttled. He does this large end study, shuttled between prison and the ghetto. And he calls this deadly symbiosis. Symbiosis allows black men to remain in a position of a kind of sub-proletariat, or what Marx would call a lumpenized or lumpen proletariat. So the ghetto prison system was used to segregate and thereby extract labor. This process of containing the black population so they could not contaminate the surrounding white areas, which would reinforce ideas that black people were irrevocably inferior. So think about that, right? Like if you're a white worker and you have access to employment, full employment, you're not going to organize with someone you see as less than human. If you're a white worker, you're not going to act in solidarity with someone who you see as less than human. So the goals, there's a kind of twin goals here of the black population in the US, is labor extraction through the reserve army of labor, and social exclusion. And if you think about this, it's actually the contradictory goals. Like, how do you extract a group's labor when the labor requires regular interaction between members of the dominant group and the members of the subordinate group? This kind of blurs the line between us and them, right? Indeed, social isolation can make efficient labor extraction more difficult when the tensions between labor exploitation and social exclusion mounts to the point where it threatens to undermine either of those systems. Well, Kant argues that the institution is then restabilize this through physical violence. This is where the police become central. Black people are kept to their appointed place at during each successive crisis. And this is what, it's drawn out quite extensively in that text. When Black Southerners moved to the north, that sort of industrial south, industrial north, the cities of the industrial north between 1914 and basically the 1960s, they were escaping the violence and the kind of daily indignities of the South. But then they get to the North and they're ghettoized. And W.E.B. Du Bois and others want to describe the Northern ghetto as a kind of black metropolis lodged in the womb of the white. So it helps to function, to extract and seclude. So the ghetto served a positive economic function as the reserve army of cheap and kind of pliable labor for the city's factories. But by the 1970s, the engine of the metropolitan economy had passed from manufacturing. So, you had the industrial hub in the center. And you see this in cities across India as well. Like you go to Mumbai, you go to Bangalore, you see that what was industrial centers are now moving outward to other small towns, suburbs. But in the case of the US, it was also being globalized in the 70s. And this is something I obviously talk quite extensively about in my book, but that basically you have them it's relocating from the center to outskirts and other cities. And so therefore the utility of the black ghetto as a reserve army of labor, it sort of starts to fall. And as that happens, in the 1970s, you see an explosion in the prison population. So that takes us to 2014, when you have the riots in Ferguson. I was trained as a kind of economic geographer. So it's interesting to see what happened in Ferguson. So in Ferguson, and this is where kind of Black Lives Matter become quite very known nationwide. But it was after the killing of 18-year-old Michael Brown, who was black, unarmed, had his hands in the air, that it became the kind of symbol of the struggle. And you have to ask yourself, like, why Ferguson? Ferguson is in Missouri. Nobody really heard of this town. And again, you have to understand it in the context of the relationship to slavery, to the ghetto, to the labor market, to capitalism. Ferguson, following kind of deindustrialization, Ferguson's a suburb of St. Louis. And you know, as cities become what you call gentrified, so the value of the land of the people in the city is greater than the value of their position or subjectivity as labor. You know, it basically defines neoliberal urbanism and displacement in America and in England and in other advanced capitalist countries. And you know, if you look at the subprime crisis that happened in 2008, you saw a combined wealth. It was the greatest dispossession of Black wealth in history. You saw like conservative estimates of $194 billion being lost in what you'd call reverse redlining. So people were being pushed out of the cities, and crises were forcing them even more out of the cities. So, you know, until the 1960s, Ferguson was what you call a sundown town. Legally, it meant that Black people couldn't be outside of their homes after sundown. They weren't allowed to be. So half the, you know, and so the city was basically 96, until we're talking about early 90s, 96% white. And St. Louis was very Black. So you have a layer of St. Louis being dispossessed from St. Louis and moving to Ferguson because of deindustrialization. So the ghetto is being broken up. And then you have a section of the Ferguson administration. So you have like 24 out of 25 police officers, the mayor, you know, everyone is white. Every city, 4 out of 5 city councilors are white. Even if 86% in a period of 20 years have become Black, they're often poor, dispossessed, don't have the right to work because they were, you know, they have some record. So all of a sudden you have this huge dispossessed Black population that's being basically administered by a fairly violent white population. And that antagonism meant that even if the levels of police brutality in a city like Ferguson was at or even less than that of, say, in a place like Detroit, where it's a majority minority police department, so majority Black and Asian, or Black and brown, not Asian, Black and Latino police force, it becomes more visible when you are in a city that's administered by a white administration and you have a kind of basically lumpenized Black population. So let's go to now. I think I'm reaching the end of my time, but so on May 25th, many of you may know this, but George Floyd, a Black man, was handcuffed, pinned down, and then murdered, choked to death with a knee by a white officer, Derek Chauvin. The officer was initially charged with third degree or manslaughter, which is like he didn't intend to kill, but that's been increased to second degree murder. And then all the other 3 police officers who were standing around have also been charged. And that's a direct result of the riots and unrest. And so since that happened in Minneapolis, unrest spread to every single city. Curfews are now in over 40 different cities, fairly unprecedented. I mean, it hasn't been for a long time. Basically, I would say since 68. There's been 5,000 National Guard who have been released in 50 states. This is kind of reserve forces, not the direct military, but reserve forces. And yeah, there's looting. I mean, I'm not ever going to judge that. These are people who have no access to the labor market, but also explicitly political demonstrations, and also demonstrations of political power. So if you're burning out police stations, if you're burning out police cars, if you're attacking the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, those are explicitly political, but then riots are implicitly political. And so some people are saying that what's happening right now is what you'd call a police riot. So, you know, the violence of the state is fairly rampant. Peaceful protesters and bystanders are being attacked with the full weight of the state and the law. But you still see in America, and this is it's very, it's unprecedented in American history, that poll after poll that came out yesterday. So a number of different polling agencies were plus or minus 2%. Mind you, this is after riots. This is after looting. This is after police stations have been bombed out. Poll after poll says the public support the protesters. You know, 56, 57% of the public versus 28, 29, 30% support the protesters. 76% said that they understand the anger of the protesters. 54% support said that they understand that why that police station was being, and almost felt that it was justified that the police station was bombed out. Not bombed out, was burned down. So that's unprecedented in American history. So, and now, there have been at least 3 protesters in the last count, probably more now, that have been murdered. And I mean, to put this in context, there wasn't a single protester who was killed during the Hong Kong protests. The media has been systematically attacked. And then finally, I would say that most recently, Trump has come out with a very confrontational approach, the modern father. He's threatened to call out active military personnel, and he's kind of taken that back a little bit to quell the riots. That he's threatened to enact the 1807 Insurrection Act against the will of governors, which is actually against the Insurrection Act. Anyways, the unrest has become, you see massive solidarity demonstrations in Paris that are very militant, in London, in Berlin. So finally, I'll just say, even though Ferguson happened under Obama, the response was what you'd see as a kind of postmodern father. But with Trump, I don't think you can disarticulate the idea that with Trump, you can the polarization is the contradictions are very sharp. So it becomes a situation in which people have to either choose the modern father Trump, this ghoulish character who's just saying wild and crazy things, or they're with the protesters. And that polarization can be used for political mobilization and militancy and radicalization. Whereas with Obama, it becomes much more difficult because he does the same thing that Trump's doing. The conditions are the same, but he's just like, I'm going to shower you with love. Well, I mean, it's basically the dynamic is, to go back to the Zizekian vignette, it's a postmodern father versus a modern father. That's the difference. Thank you.
So now let's go into some questions. Can you please explain how the impact of war on drugs had on the African Americans, especially in the biased law enforcement and high arrest and incarceration rates for these communities?
Yeah, I mean, look, you have to understand when the war on drugs actually in the early 70s, he announces the war on drugs. There's a couple different texts on this. There's quite a few scholars who have said that the war on drugs is a direct result of the militancy that you saw in the 1960s. So I'm thinking like George Jackson and the Black Guerrilla Family, Huey P. Newton, Bobby Seale, and others in, of course, Black Panther Party. You had really militant and radical movements. You had Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. You had Vince Yermos. You had the American Indian Movement, which had taken over Wounded Knee. You had you had the Young Lords of Puerto Ricans. You had various different militant movements of color, and the response was to incarcerate people in the 1960s. Whereas I think that explains part of it, but the other explanation is, like I explained with the Louis Wacant thesis, is that you have a system of ghettoization for the purposes of industrial reserve army in the 1970s up until the 60s, where industries existed in cities. And all of a sudden, once those industries go away, you are like, we have no purpose for this ghetto. Actually, this ghetto is more costly to us than putting them in prisons. So let's introduce a number of laws. And so that's why you have in the 70s, it's not a coincidence that you have the laws introduced at a particular set of times when you needed to incarcerate more people, because you don't have a welfare state in America. You don't have a welfare state for anyone, but you definitely don't have a welfare state for Black people, or immigrants. So, and yeah, the bias enforcement of drug laws, of course, the most famous of them is between crack and cocaine, that you have 15 times more likely at last count. If you have crack cocaine, that's cocaine that's cheaper, and the method is by smoking it, whereas powder cocaine, which is more expensive, and you snort it. And one, of course, the latter is done by whites and fairly well-off whites often, and the former is done by poor Black people and poor white people and poor brown people, but mostly by poor Black people. And so there's no other reason. The chemical composition, if anything, there's more cocaine in the powder cocaine than there is in the crack cocaine, but there's no reason due to the chemical composition of crack or powder cocaine. It's literally because Black people did more of it, did the crack cocaine than the powder cocaine. So you have 15 times more like higher prison sentences. That's the most kind of vulgar example of this. But of course, like the enforcement of drug laws around marijuana rather than alcohol, for example, there's no real explanation for that other than, I mean, the level of violence that you have under alcohol is far greater than the level of violence. I mean, people don't have violent tendencies after they smoke a doobie. They typically might get sprained in their hand by wrestling over a burrito, but they're not, the domestic violence levels is very high when you have directly linked to alcohol and alcoholism. Yet one is legal and the other one is heavily criminalized. Whereas those laws are actually changing now, state by state, starting with Colorado, but now because of medical marijuana. And basically in the US, in vast majority of the US, it's decriminalized. Weed is. But yeah.
And what is your stance on the whole privatization of the prisons? Actually, that has placed profit making above the public interest and created a lack of transparency also. What do you think about that?
Well, I'm a Marxist, so I oppose private anything. So that's my position on private anything. But I also don't think
more like how it has impacted the blacks and the collective.
Right, yeah. So I mean, there's actually a proportion of the private. I mean, Angela Davis has written about this quite extensively. If you're interested, Angela Davis, of course, was part of the Communist Party in the early '70s, and then, anyways, attacked by the state and was. But anyways, she writes about this, and private prisons are actually a much smaller proportion of the American prison population. But the problem with private prisons is that it creates a rent-seeking constituency of people in which they're lobbying for greater prison sentences. So there's evidence that the 3 strikes law in California was a direct result of lobbying by private prison firms. So more prisoners means more money. So of course they're lobbying for more prisoners. And also, if you create a system in which you're making money out of prison labor, what you're doing is bringing down the wages of everybody, but also it's a form basically of enslavement, slavery. So again, another book that's quite good about the continued relationship between the slave laws and current is Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, which is excellent book that everyone should check out if you're interested in this stuff.
And what is your stance on policing in general, and what kind of reforms can be brought about?
Well, I think that the police everywhere under capitalism exist to manage capital and manage the interests of private capital. I remember when I was doing some research in India, this was years ago. My book actually starts with this. Is there a number of workers who'd been organizing in a small dusty little town called Ramnagara near Bangalore. And it breaks out. There's a lot of goons that beat up these workers who are organizing in this warehouse. And we go to the hospital, and then the police all show up. And the police chief stands up and says, these factories are only here because of all these, because of all the people that were trying to do this in Bangalore. You're trying to get these factories out, basically doing the bidding of these factory owners. So it's like, that's just the most vulgar example. But the reason that if you're enforcing a law, but the laws are written for the interests of the capitalists, of course, police by and large should, under capitalism, not exist. But if we live under socialism, yes, police should be there to expropriate the expropriators. I mean, if we're supposed to take the land from the bourgeoisie, we need some enforcement mechanism. And that's why the police would be quite helpful to basically be like, give us your property or we're going to put you in jail, Yeah. That's why jails should exist. Landlords, the bourgeoisie, to put them in prison.
And how do we bring these movements like Black Lives Matter and the larger organized class-based politics together, especially in the context of America? For AFL, CIO, they stand for the rights of the police, and in a way they have been protecting these racist policemen. So how do you think we can bring these movements together?
first of all, the AFL-CIO, for those of you who don't know, is the American Federation of Labor and the Congress of Industrial Organizations. They combined. Congress of Industrial Organizations was actually a very radical federation. The AFL, quite craft union, and they get together, and that's the main federation. It's not like India where you have like 10 different federations. In the US, you have one federation, and for good or bad. And the problem is that they've always been quite racist. They've always been sexist, and they've always been anti-communist. They kicked out the communist unions in the late 40s. This doesn't come as a surprise. They protect the police, but the police aren't workers. The police are the enforcers of capitalist class against workers. So, I mean, people know that. They're not, police shouldn't have unions at all because they work against the interests of the working class. But if you're going to work, I mean, for me, it's like Black Lives Matter, being in solidarity is fine. I think that's a good thing. All forms of solidarity are important. But the US tends to hegemonize from above and hegemonize from below. So it's like if you have movements around the world, the way to be the most effective is just be in solidarity, but also to say, how are poor people, how are working class people, how are Muslims, how are lower caste people, how are they all being policed and managed in the same kinds of ways? And you draw links by through action, that's what I think. And then also through those movements, you can say we're in solidarity. But that solidarity should also be returned, of course. But also the U.S. What happens in the U.S. affects the world, unfortunately, because it's an empire, just like Star Wars. So if we, we need to being in solidarity with the U.S. and seeing U.S. empire crumble in some ways, if it does. Is good for the world. So solidarity is good for everyone, not just as showing someone here. It's because it's a part of our own emancipation as well.
So yeah, thank you, Ashok. We'll just conclude this lecture. And thank you on behalf of Student Federation of India. Thank you for throwing light on various issues of how racism becomes the central idea of capitalism and how capitalism itself uses racism. And also, let's hope for a larger solidarity among different movements. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.